Hey YouTube, what's going on? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between zoom lenses, prime lenses, and Cine Prime lenses. Let's get into it. So basically what we're going to be doing today is talking about the pros and cons of each lens, and as I go through each pro and con, you'll be able to understand the differences between each of the lenses. So to start off, we're going to be talking about the zoom lens. This is probably the most popular lens out there when talking about the different types of lenses, and if you got a lens with your camera, like a kit lens, it most likely was a zoom lens. Now, a few pros about the zoom lens, of course, is its function to zoom. So you have multiple focal lengths with one lens. So with this specific lens here, I have a 24 to 70 millimeter lens. That means I can go from anywhere in between. That means in one lens I have a 24 mil, I have a 35 mil, I have a 50 mil, I have various amounts. A scenario where this could come in handy is landscape photography. Just say you're on a cliff face somewhere and you're trying to frame up a waterfall, but it's just a little bit too far away. Well, that's where zoom lens could come in handy. Being able to zoom into like a 70 millimeter focal length could be what you need just to frame up that waterfall nicely. Now, if that 70 millimeter focal length is too close, you can always zoom it back out to something like a 50, a 55, or a 60. Basically, it just gives you a lot of options in one lens, so you're not having to carry around 5 different lenses for different focal lengths. You just need one. Now, another pro with zoom lenses, especially ones with long focal lengths, is the ability to act as a macro lens. Now, we don't have a macro lens here to show you, but essentially what a macro lens is a lens that allows you to get really up close and personal and basically catch the really small details of things like butterflies, insects, and all of that. So if you've ever seen nature photography of like a butterfly or a spider or any kind of insect, they're most likely using a macro lens. So zoom lenses can be used as macro lenses. Now, I'm not saying that zoom lenses are as good a quality as a macro lens, but if you don't have one, a zoom lens is a very good substitute. So how this works is most zoom lenses have a pretty long focal length combined with pretty short minimal focusing distance. So for example, this lens has a maximum focal length of 77 millimeters and a minimum focusing distance of 30 centimeters. What this means is that the end of the lens only has to be 30 centimeters away from the subject for it to be in focus. Therefore, we can zoom in all the way to the 70 millimeter focal length while still having it 30 centimeters away from the subject and having it in focus. So by doing this, we're going to be able to get a really close-up shot of our subject, and we're going to be able to see all those small fine details like text and texture and all of that. Now, a con with zoom lenses, especially cheap ones, is that they're not the fastest lenses. Now, when I say that, I mean they usually have a pretty low maximum aperture. For example, the lens I'm using on my camera right now is a 16 to 50 millimeter zoom lens with a maximum aperture of f3.5. Now that is only at my widest focal length of 16 millimeters, where if I was to zoom in to 50 millimeters, my maximum aperture would actually go even lower to somewhere between 5.3 and 5.6. Now that was a little bit confusing because I said my aperture gets lower, but in fact the numbers went higher. That is because we're talking about how wide the aperture ring is. So at something like 3.5, my aperture would be all the way open, so it would be at its maximum width, whereas at something like 5.6 it would actually be smaller, therefore it would have a more minimal width. So I hope that clears a bit up. Now with expensive zoom lenses like this one here, you have what they call a constant aperture. For example, the maximum aperture on this lens is 2.6, but that isn't only when I'm zoomed all the way out at 24 millimeters. Even if I was to zoom into the maximal focal length, which is 70 millimeters, the maximum aperture would still be 2.6, which is really good because that means your lens stays just as fast regardless of what focal length you're using. But to get a feature like that, you're looking at lenses that cost upwards of $1,000. Another con about zoom lenses is their sharpness. Now, zoom lenses tend to be quite sharp if you buy a good one, but if you buy a low-end one, the image is usually a little bit softer. Now another con about zoom lenses is their sharpness. Now if you buy a high-end lens like this, you're probably going to be okay, but if you go for a more low-end lens like the one on my camera, you're going to see that your image gets a little bit soft, especially if you open up your aperture all the way to 1.4 or 2.6. But other than that, zoom lenses are really good, especially if you're just starting off. That's probably why a lot of cameras come with a zoom lens as their kit lens. They're just really good, especially if you don't know what you want to get into. It gives you the option to play with a lot of focal lengths and allows you to test the waters to see what best fits with your style. Okay, so next up we're going to be talking about prime lenses. Prime lenses only have a single focal length, unlike zoom lenses where you have the freedom of multiple focal lengths. With prime lenses you only get one, and in this case 50mm. Now why would you choose a lens with only one focal length? Well, the reason you might choose a prime lens if you're going to a shoot and you knew exactly what kind of style you're going for. Another reason you might choose a prime lens is to limit yourself. By limiting yourself to one focal length, you're basically forcing yourself to think creatively and think outside the box, which usually ends up with some pretty cool results. Now, some pros about the prime lenses. One, of course, is its size. A lot of prime lenses are usually compact, small, and pretty light. As you can see, compared to the zoom lens, there's a bit of a difference. So if you're trying to travel light, having a few prime lenses at different focal lengths could really come in handy. Now, another pro about prime lenses is that they're usually a lot faster than zoom lenses. So like I was saying before, when we're talking about the speed of a lens, we're talking about the maximum aperture of the lens. So this lens here is a 50mm lens, which has a maximum aperture of f1.8. Now if we were to compare this lens to the lens on my camera and zoomed my lens in all the way to 50mm, its maximum aperture would be 5.3 to 5.6. So basically what that means is that the aperture on this lens is going to be a lot wider than my lens when it's at 50mm. Basically that allows more light to get in and hit the sensor, and pretty much means it's going to be doing a lot better when it comes to low light situations. Another pro about prime lenses is that they're usually a lot sharper than zoom lenses. Like I said before, if you're buying a high-end zoom lens like this one here, you should be pretty good, but if we were to compare this 50mm prime lens to my zoom lens at 15mm, you'll notice that this lens is considerably sharper than my lens, especially when it comes to the sides and the corners. Now to talk about some cons of the prime lens, and as you can guess, probably one of the biggest cons about this lens is the fact that you're stuck to one focal length. So just say we're in the same scenario, we're up on a cliff face and we're trying to get a nice shot of a waterfall. If you're using a prime lens and the framing is just not quite right, it's either too tight or it's too wide, unless you have another prime lens with a different focal length or a zoom lens, then unfortunately you're just out of luck. Another con of prime lenses is definitely their limitations. Some people might choose to limit themselves to a prime lens and a single focal length because, like I said before, it makes them think more creatively and outside the box. But if you only have one prime lens and you want to try to do a client video, but that client video requires you to have a wide focal length, something like a 60mm, and you only have a 50mm prime, then unfortunately you're not going to be able to do that job. I guess you could say that does tie into the con of not having as many focal lengths like the zoom lenses, but in all honesty I just can't think of many cons for the prime lenses, mainly because they are my favorite type of lens, and I feel that a good set of prime lenses is much better than a single zoom lens. Now moving on to our last but definitely not least, Cine Prime lens. These things are beasts. Basically, as you can probably guess, these are an adaptation of the prime lenses, but as the first part of the name suggests, these are mostly used in cinema. Now, why would you use something like this over a regular prime lens? Well, there's quite a lot of difference between Cine Primes and normal primes. Probably one of the biggest difference is the unclicked aperture ring. So basically what this means is that you don't control the aperture on your camera, instead the aperture is actually controlled on the lens. and this is definitely a pro. Why is this a pro? Well, as I said before, these lenses are mostly used in cinema. And let's say we're shooting a scene where we start in a room where it's dark, but we end up outside where it's light. So throughout the scene, we're going to have to change the aperture so that when we end up outside, our image isn't completely overexposed. Now, if we were to do this on camera, as you could probably tell, when you change the aperture on your camera, it usually changes in increments and clicks from one to the other. Now, if we were doing that in cinema, it would look really jerky, it would look really weird and just not nice. That's where an unclicked aperture comes in handy. This basically allows us to slowly change the aperture. Therefore, when we get outside, our aperture is at a good width, which results in our exposure being just right. Another pro for Cine Primes is the teeth around the focus and aperture ring. So if I pop off this lens here, you can see around the focus ring and the aperture ring, you can see they have teeth. So a lot different to something like this prime lens, where it's just basically got like kind of like a textured edge. And the reason that these have teeth on them is so that you can attach a thing called a follow focus. Now, a follow focus is an accessory that allows you to focus your lenses remotely. So basically you can adjust the focus without actually touching the lens, therefore eliminating any bumps or shakes you might get while adjusting focus throughout a scene. Another pro about Cine Prime lenses is definitely the way they focus. Now, that might sound a little bit weird, but hear me out. So when you focus a Cine Prime lens, you'll notice as you turn the focus ring, it will come to a stop on one end, and when you turn it back, it will come to a stop on the other end. Now, when you compare that to something like the zoom lens, you'll notice that it doesn't come to a stop. I can keep turning this focus ring forever and ever, and it will just keep going. Now, that's the same with the lens on my camera, although there's another difference between the lens on my camera and this lens. Now, the focus on my lens is powered more by motors and electronics, where the focus on these lenses are mostly mechanical. So a downside to having a more electronical or motorized focus is that when it comes to adjusting focus, it really depends on how fast or slow you turn your focus ring rather than how much you turn your focus ring. So for instance, if I turn my focus ring from here to here and I do it really slowly, it might only adjust a little bit, where if I do it quickly, it will change a lot more. Now, when you come to Cine Prime lenses, the best thing about it stopping at both ends and it being mechanical is that no matter how fast or slow you turn the focus ring, it's always going to adjust the same. So for example, if we have an actor walking towards the camera in a scene, we want to adjust the focus so it keeps on their face. So most likely we'll mark a start point and an end point for our actor, and what that will allow us to do is mark down on our focus ring where the focus will be for each point. So now when the actor walks through the scene, we can start turning our focal ring from the first mark to the second mark. And it doesn't matter how fast or slow we turn the focus ring, as long as we're hitting our second mark at the same time as he's hitting his end mark, we know that that focus is going to stay consistent throughout. Another pro for Cine Primes is how they're built in sets. You can kind of see a trend here. There's a lot of pros when it comes to Cine Primes because they're just really that good. So you usually don't just buy one Cine Prime, you usually buy them as a set. So this is one Cine Prime out of a set of 5. And the reason for this is because they're all usually built around the same size and shape. And the reason for this is that if you're on a shoot and you're changing lenses regularly, you don't want to be adjusting your follow focus and your matte boxes and all your other accessories every time you change your lens. So by having them all the same size and same shape, you don't really have to fiddle with anything. You can just take one lens off and swap it to another. So now to the cons. Well, there aren't really many cons when it comes to Cine Primes, mainly because they're just really good lenses, and so they should be. They're used in cinema. The only kind of cons you could say is that again, you're stuck to a single focal length instead of having multiple like a zoom. But like I said, these usually come in sets, so you usually have multiple lenses with different focal lengths, so that kind of just cancels that con out. The only con that I could really give a Cine Prime is its price. These things are expensive, and especially because, like I said, you usually don't buy just one. You buy them in a set from 3 to 5 or even more. And one of these things usually cost around $2,000 a lens, and that is at the low end. So you could imagine having a set of 5 at high end could come to a very, very expensive paycheck. But anyway guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll probably be doing another video on just Cine Primes because there's just so much to these things, especially when you add all the accessories and how they're used on set. But as always guys, if you like this video, hit that like button, and if you learned something today and want to see more videos like this, consider hitting that subscribe button down below. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you Friday.